In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to get to Toledo Bend Reservoir, um, where to stay, also how to catch catfish off the docks in Toledo Bend. So let's get into it. First things first, if you're not from East Texas, you got to fly into East Texas somehow. Best way of doing that, fly into Houston and just drive it up. Houston's about a 3.5 hour drive from Toledo Bend. So if you're not from this part of the country, or if you're not from this part of the world, actually, uh, give it a shot. Fly into Houston. Cheapest, best way to get flights to that area. Even for most Texas, honestly, Houston's a good airport. And on top of that, so you flew into Houston. You pick up whatever car you got to go pick up because you cannot take a bus here. You're renting a car and you're letting them know you're driving a long distance. So you get to Toledo Bend. Yay. I'm talking about the Texas side. Just so you know, Toledo Bend's the reservoir is a border lake on Texas Louisiana side. So depending on where you go, so you end up from Houston, you go to the Texas side is what I'm talking about. Great, you've done it. Now what do? You now gotta stay somewhere, preferably stay somewhere that has a dock. You don't need to be anywhere fancy. You just see somewhere that has a dock and has relatively open water because Toledo Bend is full of trees. They are everywhere. And you need to know, and if you're driving a boat, you need to know how to drive a boat on Toledo Bend because otherwise you pull too fast out of a boat lane, it's like a speed bump, but a speed bump can pierce a hole. I've heard these stories and they sound horrifying. So, that being said, cover essentially is all over the place. You just get cast out. There's no real rocket science where I was. And with that being said, the rig I have here is very similar to what I was using in Toledo Bend. Only difference was this is basically what you call a slider rig. And I'll get to... Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. Excuse me. This was the setup. Let me first talk about the setup I used. So we were targeting mostly channel catfish. I was going to use a blue catfish that I got as a thumbnail picture, but unfortunately, Google decided to fail on me, and it did not properly convert to the thumbnail. So we currently have the setup I have right here. This thing landed a 10-pound blue cat with no problems. This is a 30 size reel. I would actually recommend 40 now that I know the sizings of how small these reels actually are, because you want a little extra line capacity, especially with a bait running reel. For those of you who don't know what it is, bait running reel, pull it down, and just takes off with very little drag. I don't know if you can hear here. But essentially, it gives you a little bit of sound when a fish takes it, and also takes it with very little energy. So it's a very natural pickup for the fish. And so once you have, and this is a $40 reel. It's a good reel for $40. Smooth drag and everything. Yeah, so then once you have that, and also, if you put too much pressure on it, a lot of time a rod will bolt out of whatever holster you're using around the dock, versus this very light pressure, it's not going to happen, and you will know the fish is there. So, that's the reel. I had braid on the setup, so I would go about this is a 30-pound braid I have on here. 20, 30, you don't need something too heavy. I'd probably say 30, because just if you want to deal with more like sticks and stuff, 30 is good. And also you have more flexibility. 30-pound braid is what I had on here. 3,000 size reel, 4,000 if you want to, for this particular brand, because just the sizing of the reel with the Akuma reel. And the rod is a 7-foot. Basically, it's a 7-foot medium heavy. They call it a medium, but it's 7-foot medium heavy. Everything else is rated as if it'd be a medium heavy, like bass rod. And I just use this for my catfishing, and it works just fine. Worked great. I use also the setup for rays when I am fishing in California. I'll fish like little round rays and bonefish, and I'll soak out squid. Same setup works perfectly fine. Any ordinary bass rod, honestly, If you want to get out a bass about 10 to 15 pound test, that'll work just fine as well. These are not super picky fish, and you're not using very heavy rigs to match up with it. That being said, so rod, reel, line, leader. So I tied this leader on when I was fishing earlier today, but the leader I used on the actual trip was basically between my barrel swivel and my hook. So what I would do for the rig is, I actually talked about this in link below for it. I talked about this when I talked about the gear that you get for the beginners. Same rule applies here. So essentially, you will slide on your egg sinker first. This is a half ounce. Half ounce for us worked perfectly fine. Even when you're throwing pretty large baits, half ounce worked just fine for me. Then you would have a barrel swivel. I like to use lighter barrel swivels with this tackle because you're not using super heavy tackle. You're using 10 to 15 pound tests. You're not using 30, 40 pound tests. You don't need a super heavy swivel. So like a little 30 pound swivel works just fine. So a little 30 pound swivel also helps catch your sinker at a certain point. Then you would have a leader. So basically I would run a leader. Give me a minute. I would run a leader between, pretend this sinker now is my swivel, or my fingers are my swivel, my thumb. I would have about a 1.5, 2 foot leader is perfectly fine. It's not an exact science. Channel cats are not the hardest fish to go catch. And also as a side fishery too. So 1.5, 2 foot leader to a hook. This is a 2-aught hook. 2-aught hook for us I actually found to work super well. If you're using larger baits, like if you're using a 2-aught hook was good. If you're using smaller baits, like just a little piece of worm, go with like a 4 or 6. That's basically that's what you need to know. So now I'm going to go into baits that we used. When it comes to baits for these catfish, I actually caught my blue cat on largemouth intestines. So we basically caught a couple largemouth that I fried later that day. Yes, I kept largemouth, and it tastes great. So for those of you who are going to make comments saying, largemouth, you should always catch and release. I normally do. I was just getting creative. I was staying over somewhere, and I never had largemouth, so I was just curious. And it tastes great. It tastes so great. Also crappie too. That too. So basically, we were like, why are we going to waste these intestines and all this other stuff? I'm like, my friend, let's go use let's use the guts as catfish bait. So I took a thing of largemouth intestines, threaded a couple times on a 2-aught hook, lobbed that sucker out there, and got my blue cat on 10-pound leader and a thing of largemouth intestines. So if you go largemouth fishing the same day, or crappie fishing, you want to take the guts and use them, great option. Other baits. Night crawlers were used. Night crawlers I like to use because they're not a very messy bait, because chicken liver is the last one we used. Chicken liver works great on this hook, but it falls apart relatively easily, and a lot of people have critiques with it for that reason. I get it. And at the same time, it's a very stinky and messy bait to work with for your own hands. Versus a night crawler, compared to a chicken liver, is not that bad and will also work. So, with that being said, any 3 of those, you want to go to the grocery store, just grab some chicken liver, night crawlers. It basically all just depends on where you end up and where you're going to get your bait from. The catfish really do not care. So, either of those 3 options, and use them whole for this hook. So like most of like a good sized chunk of a chicken liver, 2-aught hook. Full nightcrawler worm, or like 3/4 or half of a nightcrawler worm, 2-aught hook. Guts of crappie, largemouth, whatever you end up keeping, 2-aught hook, or like belly fat of whatever it is, 2-aught hook. Also think, if you're using belly fat, try to soak it in whatever other juice sauce you accumulate from other baits. Sounds nasty, but it works. Just to help give it a little more scent. If you have the Procure stuff, that'd probably work well too. They just want some sort of scent. And yeah, so those are the baits that we used. Now, as far as the technique off a dock, because you're fishing off the end of a dock, you're not you're limiting, by definition, if you're only fishing off whatever dock you're staying at, you are limiting yourself to whatever space that dock gives you. And usually a dock will stick out and you have a good amount of space to work with. So what I did, and this probably helped me catch the blue cat because it helped me find out where that blue cat was. He was in a particular direction. What I did was basically we had 3-4 different rods with us, my friend and I, and we basically took them and we made what I call a symphony. We had 2 people, so screw it. We did 5 rods. I know in California you can't do this with like 2 rods or whatever for freshwater, but in Texas no one cares. 5 rods in all different directions. So we had one to our far right, for those of you just listening to this. We had one like right center. We had one that was center, and left. Okay, left, center, right, center. Clarify. But yes, so the point being was we had a full-on ensemble of rods when we tried doing this. And you can experiment. You could do 3 rods, 2, as many as you have, as many as you want to work with. If you're only traveling, you can just use 1 or 2 rods and that'll work just fine. But the great thing about this is whatever bass rods you have, medium, heavy bass rods, you could just throw catfish leaders on them and a bottom rig and use them as catfish setups if you're prepared to fasten them properly, because I accidentally lost my friend's setup doing this. So make sure if you are relying on tip movement and the full force of a catfish, tie down rods so you don't lose them. That'd be a real shame. So you've now casted all your rods as far as you could, or whatever experimentation you want to do. Make some shorter, make some longer as far as cast distance. Drag around, see if you can find a tree or something that I was mentioning earlier. Structure spot, grass, whatever there may be. And essentially from that point, you now have, and basically now you have your rod set up. And at that point, just waiting. Every 20, 30 minutes, if I do not get bit on a particular rod, or if I feel just angsty or just anxious, I will just check a rod just to be safe. Make sure there's bait on it. Make sure all's good. Recast if the bait's still on there, obviously. If not, because it's cut bait, it's not live bait, you don't need to worry about a fish dying on you or anything, changing out baits. But basically, just if you get anxious with certain rods, just check, make sure the bait's there, reapply bait if needed, and make that cast out in the same direction. And that is basically it. You have now you're now in the process of catching catfish. And yeah, just a fun little. Let me go back to that fun little story. So we were targeting channel catfish for most of this, and I caught a couple of channel catfish. It was enjoyable, not gonna lie. But at the same time, what ended up happening was my friend never even caught a blue cat before, and all of a sudden I hooked this fish. It was a good fish. I never caught channel catfish before, to have this in mind. I caught this thing beforehand, and this thing took off. I could hear the bait runner going, which is why it's a good feature, because you could just hear this when you're night fishing. If I can even get going. You could hear that drag just slightly go off, and I just basically let him eat it for 5, 6, maybe even 10 seconds. Swing, and this thing took a little bit of drag. It was going all around. I'm like, it feels like a good fish. And he's like, yeah, he's a good fish. This is a good fish, because he's normally used to catching 1 to 2 pound channel cats. And basically, we saw the thing up front. We were like, oh, this thing's about 10 pound. This thing's a nice size catfish. I thought it was like 7 or 8 when I first saw it. I was like, oh, it's a good fish. He quickly ran, grabbed out of our boat that we were using the landing net. We used a freaking landing net on this thing because I had a 10 pound leader on that setup. So he got the landing net, and then over time, we basically got boca grips out, and I checked my boca grips. Thing was 10 pounds, basically even. And I was just like, oh, yes. Nice. So, double-digit catfish on light tackle is a blast. People are gonna be like, yeah, catfish, man. If you catch 1 on 10, if you catch a 10 on 10, it is worth it. Just make sure, by the way, with that being said, please set your drags right. Have smooth drag and set it right so you don't have to have sticky spinning reels and break off a fish. Well, that pretty much settles it. This is part 1, how to get there, where you should stay. Kinda, not really. I can't really give you advice on that, honestly. And catching your catfish. So, if you like this, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will get to you with part 2 of this, which is bass fishing on Toledo Bend. All right, take care, guys.